set. Ha. I do think we might be able to wrap up this group today, though. So, but we'll see if we get there. So we still have some things we want to review with the group, and we want to check in with everyone. So let's start with introductions, like we always do, briefly. Katrina Manigan, Director of Buildings and Homes with Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency. We'll run through the city team first. So I'll go to Courtney next.
Hi everyone, Courtney Anderson, also with Kasser on the buildings team.
Thanks, Courtney. And Tom?
Tom Gleason, Green Building Outreach Administrator and Note Taker for Kasser.
Thanks, Tom. Sharon?
I just love that intro, Tom. Sharon J., I'm on the Energized Denver team focusing on the performance requirements and not taking notes.
Thanks, Sharon. Chuck?
Chuck Bartell, the Mechanical Plumbing Plan Review Engineer Supervisor in CPD.
All right, Antonio.
Thanks, Antonio Navarra, Senior Building Inspector, City and County of Denver. Also not taking notes.
Robert.
Robert Pruitt, Combination Building Inspector, City of Denver.
Thank you. And our only stakeholder here today, Elizabeth Gilmore.
Yeah, hey guys, sorry, Teams is a little weird over here today. Elizabeth Gilmore with Energetics.
Nice to see you. And Sean, I think everybody knows you, but you can say hi.
Sean Denniston, and now I feel like I need a pithy introduction, so I'll say just general code wonk for hire.
Sounds good. Okay, so today we're going to have Sean review the changes. They weren't very many. And I think I had told everyone in the last meeting that we were hoping this might be able to be the final meeting of this working group. So perhaps that's why we have a smaller group, though I'll defer to those who are here to see if that seems true or not once you see Sean's walkthrough of that cleaned up version with a couple of remaining changes that are there. And Sean's also going to mention one or two other things that came out of the last meeting that we're still working to add, but I think we'll add, one of the questions for you today will be, do you want to meet again to see those things, or do you defer to us to add them because they just sort of add another way to earn points and add flexibility? So with that, I will pass it to Sean to walk through the changes.
All right, I'll go ahead and put this up on the screen. Is that large enough for people to see? We've got notes on the side, so it always makes it a little bit more of a challenge.
I think so, and everyone should have this from Courtney on Friday too, I believe.
All right, so we'll walk through. I think instead of doing an overview, we've done overview a couple of times now, so I think we can just go through issue by issue, and hopefully that jet overhead doesn't get too close to my house and you can still hear me. So the first issue that was flagged was the need to address backup emergency power in all electric buildings. And so we looked at a couple of different ways that it could be handled. And this is the way that we are suggesting, is that we actually do go ahead and add it to the definition and leave that in the definition for both residential and commercial. The idea being that this has constantly attracted attention. And so by having it right there with the definition of what all electric is, that provides, we think, probably the highest level of clarity so that you see all electric and the provision for backup power in one place. Thinking about the way that emergency power and standby power are defined and used in the code, I think it makes sense to go ahead and leave this, use this same definition in residential and commercial, because our residential occupancies do cover R3 and R4, which have some kind of, you can call them small quasi-institutional occupancies. And some of them are healthcare related, whether this is assisted living type of facilities. And so there is the potential for emergency and standby power systems to be mandated or desirable. And then also just thinking about even a single family home could have an occupant with, you know, critical healthcare needs that require very reliable backup power. And so I don't think we want to exclude that from our definition of all electric, even for those types of buildings. So we've captured the definition of emergency power system and standby power system, which are very slightly different types of systems under the code, required in slightly different for slightly different loads. So I think for clarity's sake, it makes sense to just capture both of them. We bring the definitions. These are the definitions for these systems that are used in the IBC and then in the fire code. And so we can just bring those over and not touch anything about when they're required or the regulations around them. Make sure that that just stays in the appropriate parts of the code. We're just going to reference them when they're present. So they are accepted when they're present. And I think then the big question here is we've structured it so that it also doesn't distinguish between required systems and voluntary systems. So there are places where the code requires these systems, but building owners will sometimes choose to do these when they're not required, or they'll choose them to use them beyond what the code actually requires. This doesn't differentiate, and I think that that is the right approach. We would appreciate some feedback on that. So there's an overview of how emergency power is handled overall in this. We want to get everyone's feedback because we will propagate this across everything every time this definition is used.
Sure makes a lot of sense to me.
Thanks for chiming in, Elizabeth. I was like, at some point I'm going to take silence as this looks good. Okay.
All right.
Yeah, so I just want to add like whether like how they're used, emergency power systems, standby power systems, required emergency power systems, or voluntary standby power systems are all parts of the code that I don't enforce. So it's outside my depth. And I think we definitely should be talking with because I just want to make sure that we're not by stating because we're using clear definitions from other codes, and so in those other codes, these systems are very defined. And so if somebody's installing a natural gas generator to back up a blood bank storage, would that be allowed per this exception?
That's a great question. Sean, where did these definitions come from? Or do we, one question I might have based off what Chuck said is, do we need them? Are these defined terms in other parts of the code?
So they're defined terms in other parts of the code. Generally, when you're using a term that's not defined in your code, but it is defined in another, you bring the definition over, and then you bring the same definition over.
Mm-hmm.
So the situation that you talk about, Chuck, where we're talking about systems for power loss as opposed to emergency situations that could be kind of a broader set of circumstances, that's as I understand it, that's covered under standby power systems. But when you read through, I would certainly appreciate a review of this by whoever is enforcing the code for these sorts of systems to make sure. We've tried to keep it very simple so that we're not getting into, the issues around when they're required and when they're voluntary. That it's just if it's present, it's exempted from the definition of all electric.
I like that. I like the approach, the way you describe it out loud. I just want to make sure that we're not unintentionally creating it by using defined terms from other codes.
And as I review those codes, I don't see any other kind of backup power terminology. Like these are the only ones that are used. So these, I do believe, cover everything. So Chuck, do you know who would be the right person to review that? Are you volunteering to help connect?
Well, I mean, it would be somebody from the architectural structural group and somebody from the fire group. and possibly somebody from the electrical group. The NEC might have some power system defined or backup power system defined, but like I said, it's sort of outside my.
All right. So then we'll make sure that we get that review.
Chuck, could you send me recommendations for individuals maybe from each of those teams, and then I'm happy to run point if that would be helpful, or let us know. I don't know. I don't know anyone of those teams except the electrical one probably.
Yeah, I'll send an email. But yeah, it's going to be like Alan Yanong with architectural structural, Carol Pafford electrical, and then I would say Tony Carroll with the fire department or Brian Lucas with the fire department.
Okay. And do you want to go ahead and just email them that question, or do you want me to run point on it so you don't have to?
I can email them the question.
Okay. I know Alan has participated in past of this working group meetings. Okay. Thank you. Okay. On we go, Sean.
All right. So there's just one thing to note here on the table, and that is that we have made a slight adjustment to a couple of the point values because the direction for all electric water heating went to allowing electric resistance. And so if electric resistance is the entry point, that lowers the value of this measure. Most of these had already been reduced to keep them from, over incentivizing only partial electrification. So this went in and it backfilled, and it's really just group M. That was the big difference. I think there might have been one other, if we can turn on track changes to see, but just a minor adjustment in those to reflect that we now allow electric resistance, which gets us to the main body, I think the main changes that we're seeing in this draft. So we have the credit options for electric space heating and electric water heating. So for electric space heating, we do have some language here about not being, since the requirements for electric space heating is generally an efficient electric space heating, you don't get to double count credits for the efficient electric space heating requirement, credit option. So we just include that as a simple phrase here up in the main section of the package of the option. And then we have basically requirements for electric resistance heat and requirements for heat pump. We had discussed setting it up kind of with this 3-path option. But when it came to putting the 3 paths being very efficient envelope with electric resistance heat, and then cold climate heat pumps, and then regular heat pumps with energy recovery ventilation. And as we were putting the language together, we realized that we want the electric resistance allowance to apply all the time, even if you have other types of heating. So if you have heat pumps, we still want to allow a certain amount of electric resistance for spot and boost heating. So it can't be set up as a separate path. So it's set up just as a requirement for electric resistance. And then the next one is a requirement that the heating, when it's a heat pump, so we've got our 2 types of electric heating systems. When it's a heat pump, it's structured with a requirement and an exception. So the requirement is what we saw before for a cold climate heat pump, but then the exception is just a regular heat pump that also is provided with energy recovery ventilation. And we've just pulled in the energy recovery. So both for one of these, we have 2 metrics here. One of them is for straight heat recovery, and then the other one is for energy recovery, because they use different metrics. And so we've got those, and these come from other parts of the code, so we're able to just bring those over. So that seems to be the way that makes the most sense. The one thing that I will note that's here in the comment is that if you have an application where there's no cold climate heat pump that can meet the need, and the IMC prohibits you from using any kind of energy recovery ventilation, that does mean you won't really be able to use this option. And did want to discuss that because since this isn't a credit option and it's not mandatory, is that okay? Do we need to find another path? Or is that okay, or do we need to find another path?
Chuck or Elizabeth, I'm looking at you since you're the two that have been down in the weeds on this. I will note, I looked back through my emails and I know Linda Morrison had been part of a lot of these meetings and said she is out this week and didn't have comments to sort of send in advance on these, but go ahead.
Well, before we get to that question, Sean, I think there's a number of other things that need to be addressed. I do not know of a single package terminal heat pump that I could find where I could document that it'll have a COP of not less than 1.5 when operating at 5 degrees. If you can find me one, I'd love to know what it is. I can't think of a single one that I can purchase in the US. There's one in Germany, and I think there's one in Australia, but there is not one in the US that I can find that has that. I can think of one packaged vertical heat pump. One. I don't think that that is sufficient to make this a requirement. I think you should exclude. Basically, I think if a project is going to go all electric, let it go all electric. These requirements are terrifically restrictive. I have the same problem with number 2 there. Those are also challenging metrics to achieve. Why would we make this so hard to be considered for a project to be considered meeting the electric space heating run requirement when we're still just trying to get people off of gas? I don't understand the point of this.
So keep in mind
can I
that
just ask a question? Because isn't the ERV the flexibility to put in a regular heat pump, but with the ERV system? That's the exception that we all agreed on in the last meeting. And so maybe it's just the way it's worded, or tell me what I'm missing, because I thought that that's exactly what we've addressed by saying there's sort of a pathway for any heat pump with an ERV. What we're trying to do, of course, is keep operating costs.
Well, I may have misunderstood the intent there. I mean, I'm just trying to get projects to go all electric. This is going to make it harder. You know, if you can get them all electric, please just let them go all electric, even if it's minimum efficiency here. Give them a little credit for it. I'm struggling with this every day. And if the code's not at least incentivizing that switch from gas to electric, it just makes it harder.
Are you putting in ERV systems?
Under the current code? Like today?
Mm-hmm.
No.
Or would you, like, does that work as the way that you could do a, just being a regular heat pump with an ERV system? That's the exception, right, Sean?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's you have to have a heat pump, and it has to be one or the other, either cold climate or a heat pump paired with ERV or HRV.
So what that says is that if I have a building with natural ventilation, let's talk about affordable housing projects. An affordable housing project that uses natural ventilation with a PTAC could not be considered all electric. So it doesn't need an ERV because it's not bringing in mechanically ducted outside air. It could survive without that. We actually increase the energy use by adding an ERV, because now you're bringing in more air, your fans are running. You know, if I can just get away with natural ventilation and I don't have to do an ERV, that there's just no reason to require it. There are going to be paths forward, especially now if we're going with all Appendix G, where projects could do that. And I know, yeah, that's the performance path here. But, if a project doesn't have mechanical ventilation, they're not doing an ERV. It's the point being, there is no PTAC that we can purchase that meets these requirements. So why even write it? Like, if the only exception to use a PTAC period is if there's an ERV, then why even allow P-tax to meet the requirement? It just doesn't compute with me. There's places that people are going to use P-tax that also don't have ERVs. You know, like we've got rooms where, you know, like a little community room or something like that, where, you know, there's you know, different ways to deliver the air that are not going to have an ERV. I don't understand that. If you can't write a code around equipment that doesn't exist, exception or no exception.
Yeah, I mean, typically I've heard the rule of three, that there should be 3 manufacturers that produce a piece of equipment for it to be considered available.
Sean, what do you think of that? And can you remind us kind of how we landed on this in the last discussion? Is there something I missed in that, and or a solution that you see? Or
Yeah, in our last discussion, these were the 3 basic paths that were laid out by the group. So to either do high efficiency envelope with resistance heat, cold climate heat pump, or a standard heat pump with ERV for ventilation. So I know that standard 62 is moving away from natural ventilation, but I'm not sure how far it's gone so far. It's been kind of a constant push because natural ventilation underventilates multifamily.
So if we're talking about if it's multifamily, and you're going prescriptive, the project has to use ERVs. So what this does is further restricts the efficiencies for when you might be using P-tax that don't use ERVs, which is not going to be the majority. You know, you're covered with, you know, as the for the standard package, but there's still there's going to be places where P-tax and V-tax have their place that aren't multifamily. And this would basically, if a project uses those for spot conditioning, they don't count as an electric project. That just doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, it's not that they wouldn't. Well, that's right, we do.
Yeah, well, they wouldn't be able to take credit for this. So that loses the impetus to, you know, see if, yeah, let's do all electric space heating. There's no exception here for if, you know, because you're saying the building is served by an ERV. So I don't know, would that exclude? I don't know.
Recommend there, Elizabeth, that would fix it, where, because it sounds like you don't think it's a common issue. That's why folks thought these 3 paths would work last time, but there's some exceptions you're thinking of.
Well, I'll object to anything that restricts the efficiencies of P-tax and V-tax because I don't have any options there. They don't exist. So that just, you again, you cannot write a code for equipment that doesn't exist yet. If I can't buy it, we can't write that. So I may be getting really hung up on that, but that can't be included.
P-tax shouldn't be mentioned specifically because
or V-tax. I can get one.
This isn't only for buildings that were designed for P-tax. This is, I wonder if it could be a little more general, Sean, because P-tax like might need to always take one of the exceptions to your point, Elizabeth. So we're going to take out that mention of them, but there's lots of other building types where a heat pump could meet this efficiency, and
yeah, so it would. So if I understand, Elizabeth, the situation that you're talking about, you're not talking about a multifamily occupancy where there's a PTAC in every unit, or maybe more than one PTAC in every unit. That those would be covered under the exception, right? That's what. So start there.
Well, no, let's back up further. So our whole goal is to try to get buildings off of gas heating. If they can get, I can't remember how many points you showed, 6 points, 9 points, whatever category there is, for just changing a gas rooftop unit to a heat pump rooftop unit. Oh my God, please just give them credit for it. Don't make that heat pump rooftop unit so expensive and so hard to get that they give up. I'm already battling that right now. I've got supply chain issues with rooftop heat pump units. I've just had 3 projects in the last month have to change from the packaged heat pump rooftop unit that they had to a gas rooftop unit because they couldn't find it. And much less can I find it in this efficiency. I mean, I just don't see the point of making this so restrictive that we're making it too hard for people just to go all electric. Let's just start with all electric before we start to pinch down the efficiencies so much. Just baby steps. You know, it's we're fighting this battle every day, and just getting off of gas right now is going to be a big step. If we could just get people thinking in heat pump modes. I like the exception or the electric resistance heat, the 406.12.1. I think that makes a lot of sense. But further restricting the heat pump efficiencies just to be considered all electric heating, I do not agree with.
So you would propose that it's just heat pump equipment. So it's okay because they really run up operating costs a lot more in your mind, Elizabeth, to exclude electric resistance, but then allow any heat pumps to get the credit?
I would, yes.
I mean, we do know that a lot of those heat pumps compared to gas will have 80% higher operating costs. So that is what then when we are asked in front of city council, what does this do to operating costs? We will have to tell them. And that's not an acceptable answer necessarily.
So
that's
all
the
your
thing that we have to
exceptions.
also weigh, right?
Yeah.
Is
so
what
do
is
all these
operating
exceptions.
costs.
Yeah, unless we have ERVs, which, you know, there's maybe put that as a step in credit. All of the heat pump equipment's going to end up costing more than gas equipment. Even when I have ERVs, I have that.
The cold climate heat pumps don't cost more to operate than the gas equipment.
Oh my gosh, yes they do. I run this every day. I promise you, they cost more to operate. This is my job.
It's not 80% more to operate though, Elizabeth.
80% more?
It's not 80%, 90% more.
Sorry, I don't know where that number came from.
That number comes from a number of the studies on the cost of operating a regular heat pump.
Can you define regular heat pump?
A non-cold climate heat pump, which is what we're trying to avoid here because they run up operating costs. A cold climate heat pump is going to be very similar in terms of operating costs to a gas system.
No, I agree. So I think maybe you've got 2 different things going on here. There's the going all electric, and then there's, you know, the energy recovery and whatnot. The projects where we've got, let's see, you know, the one where it does make sense to go, you know, the packaged rooftop units and things like that, where those are, you know, first cost savings, they're still going to cost more to operate, even if they meet these efficiency standards here, you know, of the what is this, the number 2, you know, going down to 5 degrees, that still costs more. Does it cost 80% more? You know, I don't know. But whether we lump this all into a single category just for a building to be considered all electric heating, I think is a separate question from what does this do to energy costs. You can split out the energy recovery element into maybe a separate point category where it's not already required or something like that. But I don't think that these are the standards that we should set to consider a building to be all electric space heating. I also think that'll be
if I may too, Elizabeth.
Oh, go ahead.
I know that, and I can tell you're passionate about this one, and you know, you get to know people and doing these week in and week out. I would say that you have a good point, and that's kind of a lot of the things that I've argued throughout some of these in making a point that we can't just go from 0 to 100. We just can't. And so I'm right behind there. If there's a way for us to compromise and get there eventually, of course, that's our goal. But to go from 0 to 100 is just not logical.
Can I ask just the question again on operating costs? Are you saying, because I need proposals back to you, are you proposing that we would just, when asked the question about operating costs, say, yep, a whole lot of these buildings are going to cost a lot more to operate? Or that we say you get more points in some way if you do a cold climate heat pump or you add in an ERV system, so that we are still incentivizing lower operating costs, but you get some points for doing a minimal heat pump.
Yeah, well, I think I think that's correct, or maybe a good approach, because there's two things at stake here. There's, the operating costs, and there's getting off gas, right?
Right.
I don't know that we can be successful if we lump all those together and say, well, you only get to count as being electric heating if you do both of those things. I think that, yes, we'd obviously like people to push through and have both, but at the same time, I think you have to pick and choose. If I have a project that looks at this requirement to be considered electrically heated, gas is going to look really attractive relative to this. And there are, there's the gas path is harder, but if the project's not already all electric, and I think about, a multifamily project that has a pool, that one does not get to count as all electric. If that one looks at what they, the difference between getting credit for this versus, forget it, I'm just going to go gas, it's going to be hard to compete. I don't know that I would be successful in implementing this relative to the gas alternatives. So I'd like for you all to look at it that way first. Let's take, first step, get off of gas. Second step, let's manage costs. Because and different projects will have different driving factors there. So, maybe that energy recovery is the second set of points. If you want to reduce the points for going all electric, I totally get that. If that's not enough to, get them all the way there, great. Let's split out and then do the energy recovery as a second set of points to then encourage that. Now that one is much more expensive. That's a big cost. So, can we do both? Can we do all electric basic efficiency, all electric high efficiency, all electric high efficiency, and ERV? This is almost 3 tiers that you could do 3 sets of points for to, as you say, incentivize going with the lower cost to operate. But I'm still struggling to get people just to that first step. So putting all 3 steps in there is a tough sell. It's going to be a tough sell.
That's helpful feedback. And I think that that's where we did need to just see it again, right? Because we heard from the group last time that 3 paths would be enough. And we're hearing this time that there probably needs to be a 4th for a basic heat pump that still gets some credit. Do others agree with that? And then maybe I think I'm hearing in there also, Elizabeth, that you would structure this a little differently, not as an exception, but like ERVs would be like a separate way to get points.
I think that'll be more successful because there are going to be projects that cannot physically implement the ERVs and will also not be successful in finding heat pumps that meet these standards.
Right.
So, get them,
just break those things
partial credit
so that the credits can be added different ways for different projects.
Yeah. Now, obviously, I think this is a great goal, P-tax aside, because I can't get that. But the higher efficiency stuff with the ERV is a terrific goal. And obviously we want to encourage that, but it will be the rare project that can get this.
Okay. Do you have any questions about that, Sean? If you were going to change the way that's drafted, Chuck, I saw you came off mute. Anything you want to add?
Well, I just wanted to add, so the exception of like giving credit to energy recovery systems. I mean, Elizabeth noted earlier that, going the prescriptive path for dwelling units, the ERVs are going to be required. It's minimum code. And so are we rewarding or giving credit or extra credit for teams for using an ERV that's already required somewhere else in the code.
I think
And I
Sean
think-
was gonna dig through that. Sean, do you wanna speak to, like, some, I think ERVs were required in some property types and not others, but what did you find there? Cause
It's
So
only for the
it's-
dwelling units though, right? It wouldn't be common areas, corridors.
Correct. It's non-transient dwelling units. And then so
Right.
the other spaces would be as required per the other section. So it's not as, there's definitely more options to get out of it. And there's another proposal that tries to really bring that down as well, but that hasn't been passed yet. So I don't know where that's going to land.
Yeah, so there is the requirement for ERV in the main body of the code, where it's the dwelling units that we've talked about, non-transient only, and then it's required. Basically, it depends on the percent of outdoor air that the system utilizes, and if I remember right, it's the flow rate. So I think that does then raise a question of how often the ERV requirement is being triggered in buildings in Denver, because it is mandatory for certain buildings, but not every building is going to be over that threshold. And so I'm curious if we have a sense of how often it's required. The thought was really just that if you already have an ERV, you're already controlling heating um, energy usage, which is going to help control the energy cost for heating. And so we already have some buildings where it's required. Other buildings could choose it as an option to control the energy costs. And that was the second thing that Elizabeth was talking about, was the intent of doing it this way. So I guess that would be, one question, because it's not clear. The code doesn't tell you how often ERV becomes mandatory. That's something that's entirely dependent on how buildings are built in Denver. So I'm curious if anyone on the call has a sense of that.
I mean, we're seeing it more often than we did previously. I mean, in the 15 code cycle, I believe the IECC pretty much eliminated the requirement for ERVs in our climate zone. In the 2008 IECC code cycle, we introduced some requirements on, mainly for buildings that have either a large volume of outside air, or that's a high percentage of outside air, or buildings that have continuous outside air throughout the year, over 8,000 hours. And so we are seeing it more often in some of the common areas of apartment building where it is operating 24/7. It does become more, you see it more often. Would I say a large percentage of the buildings are required to use it? I'd say no. There's still enough, I hate to say it, call them loopholes, but they're design challenges that are written as exceptions to the code that
And then a lot of them just fall
it
below
doesn't
that
allow
8,000 hour.
Yeah.
So Chuck, are you comfortable with us giving points in C406? Should it say, like, for ERVs that are not already required? Or something like that, or?
Well, I just wanted to bring it up because I know with like solar
Right.
panels and a lot of other code proposals where you can't take credit for it twice. And
Right.
this would be one of those things where it'd be a mandatory requirement. It'd be required to have an ERV, and then we'd be giving them credit on top of that. So
But I
think
wonder if we could say they get credit only where it's not mandated, because it sounds like the loopholes in the mandate are complicated, but existent.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a complicated topic, and the proposal that's currently proposed is a complicated proposal. So I'm not even sure where it's going to land when it goes through.
And I think one of the key things to remember is that they're not getting credit for the ERV in terms of points. That requirement exists entirely to manage operating costs. But to Elizabeth's point, I think probably the cost consideration is the biggest for multifamily. So Elizabeth, are you saying that you are the affordable housing projects are going through and they're just avoiding the ERV requirement by just doing natural ventilation and not doing any mechanical exhaust at all?
Well, we don't have too much going on under 2021 IECC, so, and I'm not sure what's going to change there in the 2021 IMC. So how that might change going forward, I don't know. But even outside of the dwelling units, an affordable housing project will have a spot PTAC here or there, especially if they have PTACs elsewhere. Only, just for consistency of maintenance and stuff like that. So, but just in general, PTACs and VTACs, if and when those are used, and they are used outside of the multifamily world, and maybe this is a philosophical question, and maybe people won't agree with me, but I don't think we could restrict those efficiencies to a standard where you can't buy them in order to count as an electrically space heated project. I just don't think that that's going to be, I don't think that's going to be successul.
Understood on that front. I think we can make that change. We're just figuring out how to handle the points for ERVs. But I want to move through the rest of this proposal. I'm not sure we totally resolved the how to handle ERVs, but I think we have direction on sort of the 4 tiers. And maybe that's a question for the group next time, is to look at this again and think about the ERV portion. And if we like the way Sean has structured it.
So one last question before we move on. When we're considering the impact of cost on residents is always of greater social concern than the impact of energy cost on just straight up commercial buildings. So 2021, which will be the base code, the basis for everything that's adopted in Denver, effectively makes mechanical ventilation mandatory in non-transient dwelling units because it requires the ERV. And I remember when that proposal went through, that was one of the intentions, was because we were having ventilation issues in multifamily buildings across the country. So if ERVs then become mandatory in dwelling units, that can help manage energy costs for dwelling units. That does still leave the issue of energy cost for code compliant heat pumps in commercial, non-residential commercial occupancies. But does that address the energy cost issue enough? Or does it need to go beyond that?
Sorry, I'm not sure if that was a question for me.
For anyone who has a view on it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. And so just, I guess, background on the 2021 IMC, the 2021 does require mechanical ventilation for all residential units, being consistent with ASHRAE 62.2. But Denver has adopted, and it went through code committee to, just the 2021 base code allows exhaust only ventilation, and 2021 or 2022 Denver amendments are going to require some sort of makeup air to each unit. So you're allowed to, it's not required to be exactly balanced, but you need to have a supply and exhaust in every unit. So I would predict that ERVs we'll see more of them in dwelling units. We're starting to see a few already. And then especially if they go prescriptive, which we see very few apartment buildings use the prescriptive compliance approach. But if they go prescriptive, they would be mandated to use ERVs based on 2020 IECC.
So, Sean, are you saying we might be able to simplify this to just say heat pump equipment?
To just say heat pump equipment and depend on the existing ERV requirements to manage costs for dwelling units, and just accept the cost impact for non-residential commercial spaces.
Right.
Because it's going to be less anyway, since they're less heating load dominated than residential occupancies. It'll still exist, but it does change the cost conversation away from people in their residences to commercial buildings.
Are Elizabeth and Chuck comfortable with that? Like, do you feel like that's, I mean, I think that's where you're going, Elizabeth, is like, just get them to electrify, give them more points for heat pumps than, or, you know, make it be heat pumps and not just a pure electric resistance or electric resistance with a lot of efficiency, but is that?
I think so. I think we need to also think about projects that have, you know, like the VAV with electric reheat. I mean, not that that's the ideal system, but it is. You could have the, you know, the rooftop unit as a heat pump that will probably, you can probably get something that meets these requirements, but then you do have the electric reheat in your zones, your fan power boxes. Does that system qualify as electric space heating? In my mind, it does, because at least you're getting them off that gas rooftop unit. But is that system, I think, would be prohibited under this? And is that the intent?
It would depend on how the system was designed. So how much electric resistance was required at those terminal boxes. And that's a really big if.
It would exceed that number.
I think it often would, yes.
So do we want to encourage the VAV with electric reheat as an all electric project? That pretty much exists nowadays, except with the gas at the rooftop unit instead of the electric. So to you know, think about the cost question, I'd say the cost there is fairly minimal, because the electric reheat's really where the big cost is there, and we have that now. And that's a you know, it's a really base budget system. There's some, you know, from an all electric perspective, there is some low hanging fruit to get that system to convert off of gas to that heat pump. That's a pretty easy change. Like, I can make that one work. Could we fit that into our, you know, our step one of our all electric space
How many
heating?
watts per square foot of the building would that use?
That's a tough one, because that could be, it could be a tenant requirement that we don't know yet. You know, if we do a core and shell project, we don't have those numbers. I don't think you could put it as a watts per square foot. I think you would have to allow it as a system approach if that was going to be permitted.
So the exception could be for that type of system approach.
Right.
So a VAV with a heat pump as its central, and then still electric resistance reheat.
Right. Now you could define what is the delta temperature between that reheat. You know, you could require that that the VAV system have like an outdoor air reset, so that you're getting the most out of that heat pump you can. Maybe you require that reset to go up to 65, where, you know, the norm is 60 and the typical supplier temperature is 55. So you can require that system make the most out of the heat pump. And that does have a huge impact in minimizing the electric reheat. That's a design standard we do now, is to manage that outdoor air supply air temperature reset. You could set that as a standard then, and then the delta T, the rise in temperature is how you could define that. You know, maybe you're only allowed to make that temperature rise from, you know, 65 to 95. You can only have a 30-degree delta T design temperature for that electric reheat. Now I'd have to run that by mechanical engineers, because they usually do 60, because of the risk that, you know, if you're delivering 65, and then you might have some cooling issues for those zones that need cooling. So maybe 60 is the target. We try to push it to 65. I don't know. That would be one we'd have to run past a design engineer.
Do you want to type some of that in, Sean, just as a plate, like next to the exception under, it would be an exception, right? Under electric resistance.
Yeah, it would be.
But a delta T might be a good way to do it, because the folks who have to put that equipment in will.
And we can refine the language.
What that means. Yeah.
Noting some of that there, so people can see it, and then maybe
electric.
delete everything under the word heat pump equipment for 12.2.
I'm just gonna, that's not where that was supposed to go.
And you can expand on that too. I mean, you could make those electric resistance fan power boxes have ECM motors, or, make sure that they pinch down to 30% flow. Like, you can make those still be good where you're managing that electric reheat, which is, what we would do now under the current code.
Okay. And then you'll delete everything after heat pump equipment, period. In the next section, 12.2.
I
guess you kind of already, the higher efficiency heat pumps, I guess you kind of have that in the heating efficiency credit sort of already.
Oh, right. There might be more credit for high efficiency though, huh?
So, well, here's a question for the VAV system. What about just pairing a VAV system with ERV?
I don't always have very much exhaust. So like if I look at an office building, for example, the engineer will tell me, well, the only exhaust I have is restroom exhaust, and it's tiny. So it really doesn't have much impact. It also doesn't impact your reheat, because that is only preheating the air that goes to the heat pump. So it has no impact on the reheat element.
No, but it does at least have, potentially has an impact on the total energy consumption.
It's really tiny though. I might have like 800 CFM bathroom exhaust for, a 15,000 CFM rooftop unit. It's really small. I try to sell it. I don't usually succeed. And it's mostly just because there isn't much exhaust in an office building. There's just not much to recover.
So the fresh air that is required by the mechanical code, is it just pressurizing the building in Denver buildings?
Mm-hmm.
And you're losing it through the envelope?
Yep, positively pressured.
All right.
Typically, positive buildings are what's designed so they can control the environment to prevent infiltration from the exterior.
That's what they say. The real reason they do it is because it's cheaper. It's worse for the building assembly. It's worse for indoor air quality. But it's cheaper.
Okay. Sean, do you have more questions? Can we just touch on the
No,
other?
I think
I want to see if there's anything else that we're going to need to dig into. I want to know that, I thought we were close this time. That's okay if we need to make some more changes like we did, but can we, I think we have direction on that. We'll give some more credits for efficient heat, for cold climate heat pumps than for basic heat pumps. Can we glance at the water heat and other things that you might have adjusted, Sean? Make sure we're good.
Yeah, so I think probably the primary question with electric water heating is, we backed it off from heat pump water heaters to just electric water heating equipment, which does allow for electric resistance. We do have requirements in another proposal for basically heat pump water heater readiness that we could bring over here, but if we're already talking about electric water heating equipment, I think there is a question of whether this is necessary. If that other proposal passes, then it's not necessary at all. But if it doesn't pass, do we need to have this in here? This is about ensuring that wherever your water heater goes can accommodate a heat pump water heater in the future. But these are all for kind of just a basic storage heat pump water heater, and anything that has a very large load may not, it begins to not apply anymore. So I've included it here for reference, but it seems like it might make sense to not have this in, to just let that be handled by the other proposal.
By the electrification readiness proposal.
Mm-hmm. Is this?
Any thoughts on that from Chuck or Elizabeth?
I'm gonna have to jump off for a 4 o'clock. this, I like the idea of including the electric resistance. I like the idea of requiring the readiness. I think that just makes sense. I think it would be great to encourage, again, that second tier. If you get extra points for doing the heat pump water heaters, again, love to have the incentive to encourage that. If it doubles, it should double their points. If we can get heat pump water heaters in there, awesome. Let's make it worthwhile and give extra credit for that. But regardless, I think it does make sense if we can get something in there to make those be, more heat pump ready. It's hard to know exactly what heat pump requirements are going to be in, 10 or 15 years when these get changed out. So it's a little tricky to design buildings for that now, but I don't know that it can hurt. I think I need to think about that a little more.
Okay.
For those who are able to stay, we did have the question of instantaneous electric water heaters and how to deal with them within these requirements for, heat pump water heater readiness. The approach that I took here, rather than, establishing a cutoff sizing or kind of some of the more complex approaches, was to just call out instantaneous electric water heaters that are located within 6 feet of the point of use. So that really limits it to the smaller point of use water heaters that would be serving a sink, as opposed to the large scale that kind of seemed to give people consternations about how do you exclude those really big electric instantaneous water heaters. So that seemed to be the simplest, most straightforward way to do it, since we got a lot of feedback with some complicated answers to how we might do that. So I'm curious of people's thoughts about that.
That seems to make sense to me. I don't think we see too many instantaneous electric water heaters except in those situations. I can think sometimes we'll see them in, again, like an office building where you've got, one restroom per floor and you might have one instantaneous water heater. It might be slightly further than 6 feet because it's going to be in a janitor's closet and then turn a rope. It's still pretty darn close though. I don't know that 6 feet is not unreasonable. I have to think about that. But I apologize, everyone. I've got to jump off. But thank you so much.
No,
and
that's okay.
I'm sorry I tend to rant. You're right. I do get a little passionate about this, but I know everybody's working hard on it, and we've all got the same goal.
Thank you for all your feedback. And sorry that we had one or two things that were just like, no, you can't have that. But I think we're actually getting close now. This was really helpful. I thought we were close last time, but then we needed to see it, right?
Right, chipping away, right?
Chipping away. I hope
thanks,
that the
everyone.
next one really is the last meeting because it's all the time we have.
All right,
for this
appreciate
group.
it. Bye,
Thank
guys.
You. Okay, we can let you go, Chuck, unless you have any final words. If you have things you'd like to talk about offline, we're always available also. I know Antonio and Robert are here also. They just tend to be less vocal. So any of you, if you have things you really want to chime in, but otherwise, we'll let you go and we'll go work on this a little bit more. If we have questions, Sean, you had a question just there.
Yeah, no.
We can reach out.
Yeah, I'll just echo. I'd like where this is headed. As Elizabeth said, I think getting a tiered approach for the different types for electric resistance and heat pump water heaters would be fantastic. And then there is the electrification readiness proposal. There's the partial space or partial surface water heating proposal that's going through. So there's definitely may need to be revisited how those get passed, etc.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Let you all go.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.